Greetings, everybody. This is going to be my second lecture dealing with Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. I'm actually going to talk about some background information that I hope will be helpful, especially as we move into discussing Shelley's Frankenstein. Remember, Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. And we kind of move between the two of them gradually towards romanticism and away from a more sort of classical slash, well, I say the classical approach to ethics, influenced as it was by the Enlightenment. But as we move kind of through the Enlightenment, we move into the sort of the romantic phase, and things change a little bit in terms of people's theories and views about morality and about ethics, et cetera. And we also sort of see the vocabulary changing in terms of people talking about ethics. So morality and ethics are the two terms we typically use, right? When we're talking about how we judge and evaluate somebody's behavior. We don't tend to use the word virtue much anymore. It seems a little vague, I guess, to people today. It definitely is tied to historically to a certain perspective on ethics and to a certain time period that obviously Mary Wollstonecraft was a part of. But it is different in some ways to other major theories of ethics and morality. And I wanted to go over that a little bit. The question of cultural relativity, kind of the theory of virtue ethics and sort of its nature. What is virtue ethics about? How does it work? How do people conceptualize it? Some of the intellectual virtues that are frequently discussed, in particular by Aristotle, who many see as one of the founders, at least kind of from a theoretical standpoint, of virtue ethics, trying to codify it, write about it, analyze it as he did. It's something we talk a lot in Humanities 1. And so we'll talk about that, and then I'll sort of give a little transitional discussion moving towards romanticism. I had mentioned in my first Wollstonecraft lecture that she does talk about emotion and reason, which is obviously a long precedent for separating human beings in terms of how they experience things, how they respond to things in terms of reason and emotion. There are other words, desire, passion, etc. for that. Affect, some words sometimes used. But she did not really, she talked about emotion as a part of human nature, and in some ways fairly positively. But she also, like people at the time, and again, going back through the Enlightenment all the way back through Roman traditions to Greek traditions, frequently saw emotion and reason as in conflict with one another. The idea being that reason needs to kind of control emotion, that emotion has its place and its purpose, and it certainly colors our experiences, our lives, right? Pleasure, happiness, all those things we identify with emotion and feeling that are a part of human nature that we would very much, miss if we didn't have those. But so it has its place, but it also needs to be controlled and carefully channeled by reason. So there still is a kind of a suggestion of a tension between reason and emotion. That starts to move away as we get into romanticism. And in fact, romanticism tends to emphasize more emotion, affect, etc., imagination, things we identify with emotion, intuition, as actually the center of morality, as part of our human nature. And certainly they talk about reason as well, but they sort of focus on pre-intellectual or precognitive kind of experience, not the experience where we're kind of reflecting, trying to actively problem solve about something using our cognitive faculties, our thinking ability. It's more how we respond kind of in the moment to things. And certainly we might reflect on them, but at the same time, our basic way of interacting with the world provides us with sort of immediate direct experience that is, again, emotionally colored in various kinds of ways, and that we later kind of might reflect on. And in fact, we realize there's a problem in some kind of activity we're trying to do because of emotion and affect, right? You sense or you feel that something isn't right, whether it's a physical malady, an intellectual itch you need to scratch, a particular practical problem you're trying to solve. Our ability to sense when we need to go into kind of reflection and thinking mode is indeed, again, intuition, affect, emotion, etc. And we use our imagination to solve problems. And this is something the Romantics really wanted to put an emphasis on, and even suggested that we can actually overthink things in a way that's problematic. I believe I talked in my last lecture about a poem by Keats where he talks about a rainbow for a poet versus a rainbow for a scientist, right? With the rainbow for the poet has all kinds of symbolic meaning, whereas the rainbow for the scientist would be analyzed into water particles and light reflecting through water particles, etc. And certainly both are important. Both, you could say, are provide meaning about rainbows and how we experience them as human beings, but they're also very different at the same time. Right? And there's something called the ancient quarrel going back for centuries about which was actually a better guide to human behavior: the arts as tied to reason, emotion, imagination, intuition, desire, or logic, rationality, which developed eventually into scientific thinking and scientific rationality. And even today, we sometimes think about people that are maybe more artistic in their experiences and their interests and their way of um, doing things, and people who are more analytic, more logical, more kind of scientific in their way of doing things. Now, we all obviously have elements of both, but I think we also recognize that some people are drawn more to one than the other. Maybe it's by their nature, the experiences they have growing up, um, what they come in contact with, etc. So I think it's important that we think a little bit about these things as a backdrop to our discussion of Wollstonecraft, and also, again, as a precursor to our discussion of Shelley's Frankenstein. So I first wanted to share with you um, a slide that gives you a sense, I think, for the different kinds of ethics historically in terms of um, how people group different kinds of ethical theories. There are different ways of grouping these things. There are different ways of breaking them down into different, intellectual frameworks or mental frameworks, ways we explain ethics and what it is to act ethically, how we go about doing that, what the procedure is, what the outcome should be. So here are three approaches: utilitarian, deontological, and virtue ethics. And I would say of those, probably virtue ethics would be the one be considered by many people the most dated. Utilitarian and deontological ethics ultimately grew out of virtue ethics as it started to fade a little bit with a movement in philosophy towards more of a focus on logic and rationality and analysis and principled kind of thinking, right? Acting according to principles. And with utilitarian ethics, a more kind of a scientific approach that had to do with being able to discern between sort of good and bad, happiness and pain and suffering, and figuring out what was the right sort of action to take based on those things. So utilitarian ethics, cost-benefit analysis, which is frequently used today, is a version of utilitarian ethics, right? Making a list of the pros and cons of a certain action that you might want to take. So the definition is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? Pretty common sort of notion. Do what's best for most people. That does mean, however, that certain people might have to suffer to some extent for the greater good. So the individual can kind of get lost in utilitarian ethics, and that's been sort of a criticism of utilitarian ethics. The integrity of the individual can be lost with that focus on the greatest good. The application, making a decision based on what will benefit the majority. So what you basically look at again is trying to maximize happiness and minimize pain and suffering. And looking at any particular situation you find yourself in when you have to make some sort of an ethical or moral decision. And that's where I talked about lists of pros and cons, right? What's going to make people happy on the pro side? What might induce some suffering, pain, unhappiness on the other side, and do what will benefit the majority. That means you sort of have to be able to calculate in some way happiness and suffering, right? And so when you think about making lists of pros and cons that sometimes we frequently do, you might find that there might be something on the pros list or the cons list that is really more important than the other things. It's more significant, right? Maybe one of the things on the cons list is potential death, right? That probably will weigh more heavily than other things on the list on either side. So it becomes very difficult to utilize this kind of thinking. And there actually was a utilitarian calculus that was developed by a guy named Jeremy Bentham to actually determine, what you should do in a particular situation. So pros and cons. Decision makers are forced to guess the outcome of their choice. It's hard to know what the consequences of your actions are going to be. And if you think about chains of cause and effect, how far ahead do you have to think in terms of the impact of a decision that you might make, an action that you might take, in terms of who it affects and how it affects people? How far ahead do you think in that sort of chain of cause and effect, right? A con, harming a minority and benefiting a majority doesn't build mutually beneficial relationships, right? You can really anger, frustrate, sadden people if they feel like they're one of the individuals who's losing out to the majority, right? And we even talked about that with the U.S. history documents in terms of politics, in terms of that idea of tyranny of the majority, right? When the majority does whatever it wants and completely ignores the minority voice, and how that is viewed by many people as undemocratic. Another con, it's not always possible to predict the outcome of a decision, right? Sometimes it's pretty easy to figure it out, but many instances it's not. And probably in some of the more important instances, it's not. If you are, let's imagine you're a surgeon who's trying to make a decision about a certain procedure, or what you should tell a patient about a procedure, and what the pros and what the cons are. Often, you might find yourself saying, well, there's 20% chance that this will happen, a 40% chance that that'll happen. You just don't know really, right? There's also a famous example in utilitarian ethics called the lifeboat problem, right? A ship sinks and there's a lifeboat and it only had to hold 10 people and there are 15 people who are trying to get in it. Does everybody get in and nobody lives because you sank the lifeboat because you tried to save everybody? Or do you only put the amount of people that actually can survive in the lifeboat without it sinking? And if so, how do you decide who stays and who goes? Is it age? Do you take volunteers? Right? Things get really tricky. And again, cost-benefit analysis is used today frequently in, for example, health insurance. And actually all kinds of insurance, but health insurance is a good example. What will health insurance companies pay for a treatment and what they won't pay for? They want to know it has a decent chance of being successful if they're going to pay for it, right? So there again, you get in the position of, human lives being on the line, decisions that you make about what to provide insurance funds for and what not to. What is still considered an experimental procedure. And a lot of this really does come down to data, collecting data. Deontological ethics is the next sort of major approach to ethical thinking and moral decision making. The idea that people should be treated with dignity and respect. So within deontological ethics, typically there's a view that says that the individual should not be sacrificed to the greater good, right? You try to acknowledge and uphold the integrity of the individual and of individuals, right? Next up here, identifying one's duty and acting accordingly. That's what deontological means. It means, driven by duty or driven by principle to do things, right? A great example there is the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there actually is a philosophical version of that developed by probably the most famous deontological ethicist, which is a guy named Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. So cons for deontological ethics, there may be disagreement about the principles involved in the decision and also how you apply those principles. It's one thing to have an abstract principle that says do unto others. It's another thing to think about whether or not to act in a certain way and figure out what counts as doing unto others if you had them do unto you. And being true to yourself in the way you would really want other people to treat you in making those decisions. So you have to go from typically from kind of sometimes an abstract principle or sense of duty to a particular situation, which can be difficult, versus utilitarian ethics, which really focuses on the situation, right? Utilitarian ethics, you'll notice, focuses more on outcomes or consequences. Deontological ethics tends to focus more on intention, right? On what you were trying to do. So even if things don't turn out well, if you were trying to do the right thing, if you were acting according to principle and a sense of duty that you could uphold, that was justifiable, then you're not going to be considered unethical if things don't turn out well, right? Now, it does depend on whether or not it looks like you should act in accordance with a situation by having some knowledge about that situation. It's one thing to try to save a person who's in medical situation, medical distress, with a certain way in which we might try to take something, help somebody whose heart has stopped or who's choking or whatever, and you actually do more harm than good because you know that they have a medical condition, whereby what we usually are told to do in that situation doesn't work, right? However, if you should have known that person had that medical situation, right? That's why people wear those bracelets, those medical bracelets. Then you might be blamed for not knowing that you shouldn't do the usual thing for this person, right? Because they're again, look at the individual. The next con, the possibility of making a right choice with bad consequence. How often will people claim they're doing something that is the right choice when they sort of know there's going to be a bad consequence? Will they try and justify what they're doing and saying, well, I intended to do the right thing when they really knew the consequence was going to be a negative one? The possibility of a conflict of duties, right? That happens very often, right? If you find yourself in a moral dilemma where there are two possible sort of duties that are on the line, right? One, let's say, about a sense of defending your nation. Another that says, don't harm people, don't kill people. What happens if you're in a situation where those two things are conflicting, right? And again, think about yourself as fighting the military, or trying to, even being a civilian who find yourself in a situation where you've got to make such an, take such an action. You sort of have to think what weighs more importantly there. Remember that during wars, and certainly in this country, it's something we try to pay heed to. People can be conscientious objectors. They can be a conscientious objector depending on what religion typically they belong to, and claiming that, and according to my religion, it's never okay to kill another person, regardless of the outcomes. And those people might, again, be able to, for example, not be drafted or be able to have their draft status changed because they're a conscientious objector. But sometimes we find ourselves in situations where, we're stuck there and we've got to make that decision, right? One of the examples that's frequently given is if somebody is, some people are taken hostage and you're told by the hostage taker that you decide who lives or who dies. How do you make that decision, right? One of the pros, strongest model for applied public relations ethics. It is often used in that forum, though, as I also pointed out, utilitarian ethics is often used and also in making certain decisions that have to do with providing public funds for things. And again, whether or not a certain expenditure of public money is for the greater good, or if it's only going to benefit a few people. Typically, that's kind of a litmus test for spending public funds, that it has to be for the benefit of everybody. That's why everybody pays taxes for their local public schools, even if they don't have children that go to those schools, because it's supposedly good for the community, right, to do so. So these are sort of important differences there because, and I think most people accept that they benefit from there being a good local public school in their community, that's going to make the community stronger overall. Then we move to virtue ethics, right, which is what we're focusing on here. And I would say with Wollstonecraft, we certainly have a version of virtue ethics. Certainly, I would think she is a kind of a principled person as well. So there are deontological ethics that apply here. Notice too that her discussion of religion and certain ethics and beliefs and principles and dogmas with religion. For example, when she criticizes certain treatments of religion in education, where young people learn certain church dogma, they have to memorize it and be able to say it, etc. But it becomes a burden to them. It becomes something they might reject because it's being forced on them, and they don't really understand what it means, right? It's just a bunch of words that are being kind of forced on them. So she is somewhat critical of that approach to ethics as well. And certainly we can tie deontological ethics to certain religious perspectives and maybe virtue ethics in a way as well. But certainly when we think about religion and principle and duty, et cetera, again, the golden rule, we would think of deontological ethics first. So as virtue ethics, what virtues make a good public relations professionals, right? Making a decision in light of those favored virtues. Becomes a big question. What is viewed as virtuous in a particular community, in a particular nation, in a particular culture, in a particular religion, let's say? That becomes really important here, right? Which is why sometimes people adjust and adapt their behavior. You do see politicians doing this based on what their sense is of the most important virtues of the community they represent. Do they represent a virtue of rugged individualism, or do they represent a virtue that says try and serve the overall good of the community first? Let's say one of the cons misses the important obligations to client and publics, the possibility of a conflict of virtues that can happen as well, especially when you're talking about virtues between different cultures, people from different backgrounds. Or just within a community that has people with different belief systems that therefore have different virtues, right? So you can see, even though we have three groupings of approaches to ethics here, these are not sort of hard and fast separations. You can't really pigeonhole these three because they're all kinds of hybrids. There are ways in which sometimes both things apply. I'll give you an example in utilitarian ethics. Sometimes there is a prohibition in what's called rule utilitarianism that says that you can never kill people or should never kill people. And that doing so is always a bad thing. It's such a con, it's such a negative thing. It causes so much suffering and pain that there's never any kind of amount of good that can come from it that would allow you to say that the greater good is taking somebody's life, right? And sometimes that rule utilitarianism obviously is using deontological ethics because it's using rule following too, right? It's saying regardless of the outcome, it's never okay to take somebody's life. So there's a hybrid in rule utilitarianism between traditional utilitarian ethics and deontological ethics. Okay, so next up here, we're going to talk about the question that I just sort of raised of cultural relativity with virtue ethics, right? Does it apply universally? Or do virtues and the way we use virtue ethics depend on our culture, right? And think about virtue ethics back at the time, for example, of Aristotle, where you had all of these separate city-states, and then you had these empires developing that did have different senses of virtue. In Hum 1, in my section at least, we read about the Peloponnesian War fought between the Athenians and the Spartan people. They had very different sense of virtue. They were very different cultures. One was cosmopolitan, one was rural, one was agrarian, one had big trade and a large navy. One lived an opulent life, the other focused more on meeting people's basic needs. One was more warlike than the other, etc. So it does sort of raise that question. For example, as it says here, in Homeric Greece, so that's Greece during the time of Homer, the ideal virtuous man was the hero or warrior, and the virtues were strength and courage. those two virtues tended to be near the top of the list if you look at people's accounts of, for example, what Aristotle says about virtue in his day. Notice that those are things, typically, that males can achieve and that women don't have a chance to achieve because they're typically not going to be a part of that hero or warrior class, right, of society. So it seems like that particular virtue of strength and courage is more likely going to lead us to bestow on somebody the title of being a virtuous person because the opportunity to be a war hero, for example. For virtue, Aristotle is linked to rationality, and the ideal virtuous man is the Athenian citizen. And so there is also that sense of, are you a good citizen? And for Aristotle, that meant doing what's best for the society overall. Less of a focus on the individual there and more of the focus on the good of the society overall. For example, for Thomas Aquinas, who comes later, virtue is related to religion. So virtues are faith, hope, charity, and humility. Right? You might recognize that quartet. And the ideal virtuous man is the saint. For Benjamin Franklin, virtue is related both to earthly and heavenly success. So the virtues were, among others, cleanliness, silence, industry. You might identify those with the Protestant work ethic, right? Which was indeed became a part of public education in this country, especially in New England, with the development of the first public schools. Really kind of followed the Protestant work ethic. And then maybe virtues are not relative, but their application in different cultures may differ. And I would say both can be the case, certainly, right? The virtues may be relative. One thing in one culture might not be virtuous. It might be in another culture. But I would say there typically probably is quite a bit of overlap, but how they're applied might be very different, right? It has to do with the view of success, the view of what it means to be a good person, what the goals of the society are, or the culture are, what it values, right? Those are going to determine maybe what the virtues are. Certainly, if there's a hierarchy of virtues, that'll determine which are the most emphasized, and also what those actual, how you actually apply those virtues. How do you become a heroic person, for example, in a culture that doesn't really emphasize warfare and being a warrior? It's going to be different. Maybe it's the person who helps save other people's lives by putting their own life on the, in jeopardy in a flood or a hurricane or some other kind of a situation where other people's lives are in jeopardy, versus in a warrior culture where the hero is probably going to be that warrior person. Okay, so next up, sort of the theory of virtue ethics. Virtue theory is the view that the foundation of morality is in the different development of good character traits or virtues, not good acts. So there's more of a focus on how you generally behave, not so much on individual actions that you might take. Now, certainly, your character will be measured by the different individual acts that you make, how you behave. But it does focus sort of on your general kind of character traits, right? When we think about characters made up of your habits, how do you usually act in particular situations, right? A person is good then if he has virtues and lacks vices, right? If you tend to do the right thing based on your culture, your society in which you live. Typical virtues include, and these again, you can see sort of a combination of those that you would see in a place like ancient Greece with some that are a little more modern. Courage is almost always at the top. Certainly it was near at the top with Aristotle and the ancient Greeks. Temperance, right? Not acting too rashly in any situation, right? Justice, prudence, fortitude, liberality, and truthfulness. And for Aristotle, the virtuous action was typically what he described as the means between two extremes. That was the target you should aim for, right? So if you're trying to aim toward courage, you wouldn't want to be reckless. That's too far on one side of courage. You overemphasize it. Temerity, being too timid, is too far on the other side. It's lacking courage too much, right? But courage is that mean between the extremes. Sometimes it's called the golden mean. So all of these virtues are sort of means between extremes. Some virtue theorists mention as many as 100 virtue character traits which contribute to making someone a good person. Again, different people, different cultures, different societies will have different kinds of virtues that they emphasize and different numbers of virtues or character traits. Even in this country, when character education started to become really popular in 1980s and then 1990s, there was an emphasis on things like responsibility and respect, along with the other 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sometimes it was called the 4th R. That certainly reflected a certain view of morality and of ethics. See, next up here. The nature of virtue ethics. This has been some overlap with the previous slide, but you'll have some things that are slightly different here. Virtue ethics claims it's important to not only do the right thing, but also to have the correct disposition, motivation, and emotion in being good and doing right. Right? That's an important part of it. Right? We would like to believe that people do things that are virtuous or ethical or moral, not just because they're following some abstract principle, which could be true, for example, with deontological ethics, and not because they actually feel that they're doing the right thing. And typically, we also believe that doing the right thing is a function of emotion, um, of sentiment, of being able to empathize, right, or sympathize with somebody, right, and you're doing it for the right reason, the motivation, right, and with the right attitude, and that those things kind of go together. These are things that Aristotle, in particular, really emphasized a lot. Right? So it's not just doing the right thing; it's doing it with the right attitude, with the right motivation, and also with some sort of feeling um, that's kind of motivating it, and that that it feels good to do the right thing. Right? We often talk about that. Virtue ethics is not only about actions, but having a moral character, one which feels the right thing at the right time and acts accordingly. So again, moral character is sort of made up of a combination of different virtuous habits that we try to develop, particularly in young people, that make up the overall moral character. And it takes some practice, what sometimes Aristotle called practical virtue, to know how to do the right thing at the right time in the right situation, right? Because situations are different. Aristotle recognized the particularity of different life situations, and that doing the right thing often was not just because you had some idea of the right thing was to do, but you know how to do it in that particular situation, right? So we often, before we act in a way that could have major consequences, and we have a tendency to act in a certain way, we might stop and think, okay, in this particular situation, is this the right thing to do? Right? And try to understand that situation. Now, sometimes there are things we're not going to know about, right? The person who we end up injuring, trying to save them when their heart stops because we don't know they have a medical condition and they don't have a medical alert bracelet on, so we don't know, right? But there are times in which we should sort of know that not to do what we usually do in a particular situation. Because of the particulars of that situation. Maybe in that particular situation, somebody's more likely to be harmed by what we might do than in another situation where they're more likely to be helped by it. So we need to understand that as well, that kind of particularity of the situation. And practice. Virtues don't come built in, they must be practiced again and again. Aristotle emphasized that you learn to do the virtuous thing, to develop virtuous habits by actually doing them. So there's less of an emphasis on virtue being something that we're sort of born with. We're born with it as a potential, according to Aristotle. He was all about actualizing human potential. The reason that's good to emphasize here is that the Romantics will say something slightly different. They will say that, and they won't use the word virtue maybe as much, but morality is something that it's part of a natural moral sentiment that we're all born with. And I'll get into that a little more in a minute. And then lastly here, the different, let's see if I get the right one here. This focuses a little more on the kinds of virtue that the last slide sort of suggested. And these, again, can be traced back at least as far back as Aristotle. So there's sort of intellectuals and moral virtues and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues are things that you can only really develop as you become older. Aristotle even said that you could only really develop them when you're at least 18. We typically think about that when we think about wisdom, right? Remember the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Wisdom is not just knowing what the right thing is to do, but how to apply it in the right circumstance, right? So knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit and not a vegetable, but wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad, right? So it takes life experience, understanding, prudence, right? Those things take life experience. You could be really, really knowledgeable, even as a young person, and just not know how to apply or how to use that knowledge that you have. That's a pretty common theme, I think, in how we think about people's actions. And it's typically taught through, instruction, how to problem solve, different approaches to problem solving as well. When we think about developing what we might call intellectual virtue today, we might talk about different views of problem solving, different ways of thinking yourself through ethical dilemmas that you might face. And then there are moral virtues. And these are the things we start trying to teach when people are really young, because they don't have the intellectual capacity yet. We focus more on developing the right habits, right? That sort of idea that it takes a village to raise somebody, right? So we try to put them in situations where they're more likely to develop a virtuous habit. Parents certainly do that in the way they interact with their children and the kind of household environment they create for them. Teachers do that, especially with really young children, right? Because they can't really always know why something is the right or the wrong thing to do. And you can easily get into this sort of back and forth with a young person. If you try to say, here's why you need to do this thing and it's the right thing to do. And they might say, well, why is that the right thing to do? And you might give them an explanation and they go back and forth. Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked actually about that quite a bit, that you can get in one of these loops because you just can't, they can't understand the explanation you might give for why doing something is good or bad, right? So we just try and inculcate those things in them as a result of habit. And you can do that when people are obviously very young, right? Building really on the kinds of instincts that human beings have that you can, kind of work from. Not natural or inborn, but acquired through practice, right? So you learn to be a virtuous person by doing it, by practice. So we do that with young people, again, before they have the ability to, in more complex life situations as they become older, to reason about what the right thing is to do and to problem solve. We want them to do it through just practice that develops habits. So habit or disposition of the soul, as Aristotle might put it, which involves both feeling and action. Again, not just doing the right thing, doing it for the right reasons, with the right motivation, the right attitude, and a sense that you're doing it because it feels like the right thing to do, because you empathize with somebody, or because of some aspect of your affect as a person. So that is some background on virtue ethics. So just quickly here, just a couple other things and I'll finish up. In Aristotle, you tend to see something that I think is also interesting here. When you think about virtue, the words virtue and virtuosity kind of having the same root. And there was a sense in the ancient Greece of Aristotle's day, and I would say you would still see it to some extent in Wollstonecraft's day, and I think we still see it somewhat today, where learning how to do anything really well, so you become an expert, you develop virtuosity, right? As a musician, as maybe a certain kind of intellectual, as an athlete, whatever it might be, that we ascribe at least some idea of a certain amount of virtue to that, because somebody really put in the hard work to become an expert at something. And especially when they share whatever that expertise is with other people, right? that I think even the word virtuosity today sometimes is colored a little bit with that idea of virtue. And that was much stronger even in Aristotle's day. So, for example, you could be a virtuous flute player by learning how to play the flute, really well, working at it really hard, using it to contribute to the betterment of your society, right? The same thing of being a farmer or somebody else. And so everybody had the opportunity to be virtuous, not just when it comes to what we think of as moral or ethical situations, but in their everyday lives and how they act, right? And act in Aristotle, he would very much emphasize for the greater good. Now, let me talk a little bit again about Romanticism, because that's where we start to see this shift. And we will see it as we move even from sort of mother to daughter here, as we move from Mary Wollstonecraft, who is starting to find a more positive place for reason, emotion, for emotion, sentimentality, affect, feeling, but does not fully embrace the romantic ideal that sort of comes later. But you do see it more in Mary Shelley. And you will see it in the monster in Frankenstein. And you need to remember, sometimes because of comic books and just sort of popular culture, people sometimes call the monster Frankenstein. That was not the case. As you'll see in the book, some of you might already know, Frankenstein was the inventor who created Frankenstein. He was just known as the monster. And there's some other terms you'll see that are used for him as well. But you will see how in that book, he came into the world as all people come into the world, right? As babies come into the world. And of course, for him, the issue is he's coming into the world with his old body, but no life experience, right? With sort of a natural kind of moral compass, a natural sense of right and wrong, what was sometimes called moral sentiments, right? And that the Romantics would argue, and Rousseau did, for example, and I believe I talked about that with my earlier Wollstonecraft lecture, that we are born with a natural sense of morality, and it's up to our society not to corrupt it and not to sort of meddle with it too much. And there are theorists today who still make that argument, that young people are actually more moral in certain ways than adults are, and that we learn as we get older to compromise, to do things that we would have really upset us when we were younger emotionally, right? Because those natural moral sentiments, when they're fulfilled or not fulfilled, typically there's a strong emotional response to that, right? You kind of feel what the right thing is to do, and that we want to try to maintain that. And that, again, for Rousseau in particular, people losing that natural moral sentiment is the fault of society and the corruption of society, imposing societal kind of conventions and a societal sense of morals and ethics, et cetera, onto people. So you'll see this idea of natural moral sentiments. I will also refer to it when we discuss Frankenstein as a natural moral compass. I kind of like that word, right? That we're born with a compass that kind of tells us which direction to go when we have to make decisions or do things. That we're being guided by our natural moral sentiments. And we'll talk about the characters in Frankenstein, especially the scientist who created Frankenstein, named Victor Frankenstein, and the monster himself, about their natural moral compass, right? Are they following it or not? Is it corrupted? Is it being nurtured and supported by the people around them or not? Very much important themes in Romanticism and in views about morality, ethics, etc., in Romanticism that we will speak a lot about, as you can obviously tell, when we do get into discussing and reading Frankenstein. So I hope you found that helpful. Remember, we'll be moving on to Frankenstein very soon here after our break for the midterm. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email, etc., and I'd be happy to respond over email or over Zoom to whatever questions or issues you want to discuss. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you later.